So now let's go in and let's start playing with this concept of floating. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go start with box number 2, and I'm going to apply a float to that. Now I could use any of the methods that I have available to me, and I will use several of them in here in order to apply the rules that I want to look at. So I've looked at box number 2, and I've told it to float left. So what that's saying is float over to the left. And what happens here? Well, the content from box 3 shifted over here. Now, why on earth did that happen? Let's take a look at that. So I'm going to shift this from left to right. And what you need to pay attention to is that normal flow of the document and what's happening here. So when I put it to right for box 2, it moves box 2 over there, and box 3 comes up into the normal flow of box 2. So what that tells me is that when I'm floating, it is moving that element out of the normal document flow. So what happens when I left that as left is that box 2 stayed there, but it's also out of the normal document flow, so that frees that space where box 2 is for other things to move up into it. It happens to be that box 3 is the exact same size, so it slides up under there, but the content knows that there's other content there. So while the box moved up there, the content overflowed from that container to some place where it could be seen. And so you end up with this sort of strange configuration. And so, again, when you see that, you know that there's something going on where an element has slid underneath another element, and yet it still needs to display its content. And so, since they're all at the same level at this point, it just overflows the location of it, and then does the best that it can to try and display that content. So I have applied a right float to box 2. It moves out of the way. Box 3 comes up and takes its place. Now if I go to box 3 and I apply a float, and let's do right again, then you'll notice that it slides over and box 4 comes up and takes the place that 3 had, which is really the location of box 2. And no matter how big this gets, these will continue to float over as far as they can towards whatever margin was specified. The default is that it wants to go up and it wants to go over. So the question is, why is it that when I had box number 2 floating, it didn't go up beside box number 1? And the reason is that in order for an item to float past another item, that other item has to be floating as well. So if I change box number 1 and I give it a float of left, then we're going to see the others pop up there next to it. Now notice that box 4, since it had the left positioning as well, it slid up under box number 1 because now it was able to float up in there, whereas before we had that positioning, it wasn't able to do that. So what we've got to do is we've got to find a way to keep an item from sliding up underneath something else, and that is called a clear. So I'm moving back to box 4 here, which box 4 has slid up under box number 1. So I'm going to go ahead and take this float off of box 1 and move things back down where they were. And now, so again, we've got box 4 there floating over to the left. Box 3 and 2 are floating to the right. They're fine because there's nothing in their way, and everything is staying below box 1. But what I want to do is I want to add a rule to box 4 that that will prevent it from moving up underneath that box. So what I'm going to do, it's called a clear. And what a clear does is you can think of that as being placed at the top of whatever element you're working on. And what that clear does is it prevents the top of that box or that element, whatever that element is, from floating up next to or underneath another element. And the choices that you'll normally see are both, left, or right. I'm going to choose both, so that will prevent it from going up next to boxes either on the left or the right. And when we go ahead and refresh that, then what it's done is it's dropped down because it can't come up above this box 3, because box 3 is actually the element that sits above box 4 in the document flow. So let's go ahead and go back to box number 1. We'll add our float just the way we had it before. Let's check it and see what happens. Notice that box 2 and box 3 slide up and they're floating next to box 1. Box 4 is not going underneath it because it has that clear on there that prevents it from coming up. So let's play with this box 4. Let's see if we can get that to position over here next to these others. So what I'm going to do with box 4, I'm going to go ahead and take off the clear so it can go up, and I'm going to put a float, and I'm going to float this one right so that we can see what it does there. And it comes over, and it doesn't go all the way up. It comes over as far as it can, but it can't go up because this content is in the way. And this is where that idea of floating comes along. If, however, this page had been wider, then that box would have floated up. And so that's one of the key things to understand, is that when something is floating, it's not going to push through something. It's going to float with it, depending upon the ability to do so. So as we get narrower, when you notice that the viewport is narrower than the space available to it, it won't float up into there. But as it gets wider, it allows for things to slowly move further up into that flow, and it makes its way up, floating to the right. So now let's look at the difference between left and right. Now box 1 is floating to the left. If I change that to the right, then what it's going to do is it's going to move all the way over here to the right. Now why did it go all the way? Because that is the first element that occurs in the normal document flow. So as it's interpreting this page, and I'll narrow this back down so that you can see what the normal document flow would be. The normal document flow of this is, let me narrow it down even a little bit more. And you notice that that footer floated up in there too, and we'll deal with that in a couple minutes. In the normal document flow, we've got box 1 at the top below the header. That's the first of the floating elements. And then we've got box 2, box 3, and box 4. So it's going to try and float box 1 first. So that will go over and take its new position. When it does that, actually these are all floating in the same direction, so they're over there. But when we make this wide enough that we can have 2 side by side, box 2 floats up there next to it because it can. Box 3 slides over, and box 4 comes up and sits next to it. So, and again, as we widen that out, one by one, those boxes will come up and take the location that they're able to float up to. Okay, so that's a lot to think about, but it is crucial to understanding how things are going to occur, because knowing how those boxes interact, and that's the key thing to understand, is that when you are dealing with floating, these elements interact with each other, take up the space. In floating, it's absolutely dependent not only on the other elements, but on the rules that they have to them. So what I want to do is, I've got this footer down here, and I don't want that to come up through my information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to that footer rule, and I'm going to give it a clear. I'm not going to give it a float, and I'm going to do both. And you notice that when you add that clear, that pops back down.